I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the dynamics of the political party and electoral system play into this, and particularly what I would personally characterize as the lack of a really strong opposition party that doesn't call the Republican Party out on this in two different ways. One of which is on the racial appeal, they tend to, I think, all too often enable and reinforce these types of coded racial appeals. So, I mean, and also with respect to policy. So in 1965, it's LBJ who passes the Federal Assistance to Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which is targeted at inner cities primarily, and it's really targeted at African Americans in inner cities. So this is the beginning of the war on crime.
Right.
Or the fact that, often unknown fact, that the first person to use the Willie Horton story was Al Gore in the primaries.
Right.
Or, Clinton's Sister Souljah
Right.
stuff.
Right.
Or Obama's, constant appeal to folks about black people need to take responsibility for themselves. All of that, which I think lends to an enabling of this kind of coded appeal. On the other hand, the enabling in the form of, on the economic policies, that these sorts of policies have been implemented over time, not just by Republican administrations, but by Democratic ones. In fact, all the sort of hallmarks of Reaganomics were first initiated by Carter in the late 70s, and NAFTA and now the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, all these sorts of things are, there's this bigger systemic issue, and I think it has to do with a lot of factors that are systemic in character, rather than, these are bad people versus good people getting into office.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Although I'd say race is systemic in character too.
Sure.
It's not a story about bad people. But I really like your two questions. I think they're fantastic. If we step back, we really need to think about how the Democrats have responded, and then we need to ask why they responded as they did. But in effect, the response was set out by these two, Scammon and Wattenberg, by these two Democratic pollsters in 1970. Essentially, they said to themselves, they and to the Democratic intelligentsia, we're losing votes on the issue of race. There is a backlash. There is a natural reaction to this, and we need to distance ourselves. And that quickly segued into, we can ourselves take advantage of this sort of rhetoric. This has had disastrous consequences for minority communities and for the country as a whole. For minority communities, you absolutely see the rise, for example, of sort of a competition between Democrats and Republicans about who can be harder on minorities, where there's rise of racialized mass incarceration. And it's worth pausing here to say, there's some very interesting work showing that there's an inverse relationship in Congress between support for civil rights and support for increased funding for police, right? So that the language of law and order becomes the de facto language in which one opposed civil rights, right? So, but you can think about racialized mass incarceration. You can think about what's happened to the social safety net. You can think about what's happened to education. Those things have harmed the population broadly, but they've harmed the poorest people most intensively, and the poorest people are disproportionately people of color, right? You can also think about mass deportation. So we're deporting people at a rate of around 400,000 a year. That's a rate higher than George W. Bush ever did. We've never, in the history of the country, seen a sustained rate of deportation this high. And it's because Obama doesn't want to be seen as soft on the immigration issue, right? And now the Republicans are also partly to blame. I was listening to NPR this morning, and I guess they've got this. Republicans have there's a law in the books that require a certain number, that require that beds in detention facilities be filled. And ostensibly, this is to ensure that our immigration laws are enforced. But what this is doing is this is forcing police officers and ICE officials to arrest undocumented immigrants for the most minor of violations, things that would not otherwise lead to arrest or detention, but to actually detain them and incarcerate them in these detention facilities, because there is literally a quota mandate. They have to fill these beds, right? So I think that what you've seen is a democratic response that says, A, let's stay silent and let's not call this out, and B, we can actually do pretty well if we imitate it ourselves. And the result has been horrendous for communities of color, but it's also been bad for the country as a whole, for the middle class. Let me switch now to think about this sort of policy, and especially your comment about Carter. Yes, with Jimmy Carter in 1978, you begin to see a shift rightward in terms of economic policy. You begin to see the Democratic Party turning its back on the working man, right? And the Democratic Party had a much stronger identification as representing the working man against the threat posed by concentrated wealth. And Carter begins to shift that. And how can we understand that? I think it reflects a mobilization on the part of corporations and the rise of think tanks that begins in the very early 1970s. And they begin to have influence that expresses itself in 1978. This is a way of talking about the increasing sort of ideological muscle of corporations and also the increasing penetration of wealth into the democratic system. Are these independent causal factors? Are they separate from, in fact, do they displace race? And I want to say, no, they actually work hand in hand with race. Right? These think tanks are coming up with new arguments for conservative, for cutting taxes, for cutting welfare, for cutting investments in infrastructure. Some of those are couched in racial terms, some are couched in gender terms, some are couched in more libertarian terms, but it's all part of a larger effort for concentrated wealth to reassert itself and in a sort of a robust defense of the conservative or the anti-government, the big business, small government politics of Goldwater that had been defeated. So, yeah, there are these other systemic factors, but I think that rather than saying, well, is it one or the other, it's important to see how they're actually working hand in hand. Now, about the Democratic Party, Obama would say right after his re-election that people misunderstood him when they thought that he was a socialist, let alone even a liberal, and he said, if you put my policies back in the 1980s, I was much more like Reagan. And he's right. The whole Democratic Party has shifted to the right. Yet it's still the case that, and this is a Princeton political scientist did this work, it's still the case that when you look at the fate of the middle class and the working class under Republican and Democratic administrations, the income of wealth, the income of middle class families increases twice as fast under Democratic administration compared to Republican administrations, and the income of working class Americans increases 6 times as quickly under Democratic as under Republican administrations. So Democrats have absolutely shifted to the right, but the Republicans have gone crazy. Right, and so there is still
but there's a causal relationship between the two, is what I'm suggesting.
Yes, absolutely.
It's giving more leash.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Yeah. I completely agree. Others.
So when I think about the facts that you were talking about, the most recent election in which Newt Gingrich made the food stamp president comment, and Romney with his 47% comment, and John Sununu was sidelined for the duration of the campaign after those specific comments, for those comments. Romney lost. Gingrich also was hit hard in the press over that. And then the comparison between the percentage of whites who voted for Nixon, say, in 72 versus the percentage of whites who voted for Romney in the most recent election, 2012. I mean, isn't there a case to be made that the electorate is learning to detect these dog whistle signals, the racism of the Republican Party?
So, yes. And opportunistic politicians are learning to craft new appeals that aren't recognized as racist, right? So if you think about Willie Horton, one of the striking things, so Tali Mendelberg did this study of the Horton campaign ads, and one of the striking things she found was that there was a broad rejection of the idea that the Horton campaign was race baiting at all, that endured essentially for 3 years until internal documents from the Bush administration began to surface, right? And then here are these sort of here's the smoking gun where you've got these people who are saying, this is what we're doing, let's go out and do some race baiting. Okay, and they wrote it down, and now the press discovers it, and then they say, oh, whoa, maybe that was about race. And now, Horton is shorthand for race baiting. And you couldn't do that again. You could not use Horton again. On the other hand, and you've got, in 2005, Ken Mailman apologizing for race baiting, and in 2010, Michael Steele apologized for race baiting. So you've got this progression where the Republicans have been caught, and then they've apologized, and then they've sworn never to do it again, and then, John Sununu sidelined after he injects these comments into the national conversation, right? So there is this complicated ballet in which people are making these racial appeals, and yet if they're surfaced too clearly, they distance themselves from them, and then they go on to something else, right? And so I really think it's like this dynamic is likely to continue. What can we say about the electorate as a whole? I want to acknowledge that the election of our first black president is of monumental significance in terms of progress in race relations. Right? It's really amazing. I think most of us, whatever we say now, I think few of us before about November 3rd of 2008 really thought we were going to get a black president. Right? I mean, it just seems so inconceivable. Okay, so this is really a monumental significance. On the other hand, we can see that white support for Republicans is increasing over the Obama administration. So when you look at 2008, the gap in the white vote for Obama versus McCain was 12%. In 2012, it was 20%. Right? And 59% of whites voted for Romney. Among those who voted for Romney, 90% were white. Among the Republican Party, Republican elected officials, 98% are white. This is really a party by and for whites, right? And it's an open secret, and that support's increasing, right? And now we can talk about the House Republican districts and whatnot. So these sorts of racial appeals, they're not going away. Sometimes they get recognized, but new ones emerge.
I wouldn't suggest that they're going away, and also I absolutely agree they are effective, but I want to. I'm just asking, over the course of, say, 1970 to now, couldn't you say that they are slowly becoming less effective? I mean, given the percentage of whites who seem to respond to them in 72 versus right now.
Well, 72 is a bit of a high watermark, but not in any. There's no sort of linear down sloping line, right? So you think about Clinton, for example, and he's so I've got all the figures in the appendix. I can just run through them. So I'm going to run through very quickly the percentage surplus of white voters for Republican candidates versus for Democratic candidates. So, for example, Richard Nixon in 1968 has 16% more white voters than Hubert Humphrey. Then he goes to 40% more. Then Gerald Ford has 4% more, partly because Gerald Ford declines to engage in race baiting, but Jimmy Carter does. Ronald Reagan in 1980 has a 20% surplus. Then in 84, a 32% surplus. Then George Bush, a 20% surplus. Then Bush in his when he loses to Clinton has a 2% surplus. Bob Dole has 2% surplus. So it really falls. Then it goes to 13% in 2000 for George W. Bush. He increases his support to 17%. It falls to 12% for McCain. It goes back to 20%. Right. So I don't think there's a comforting story here of whites learning to recognize racial appeals and gradually turning away. I think there's a comforting story here of a falling percentage of whites as a total part of the electorate. Right? And so the numbers run in a linear fashion. It runs from 90% in 1960 down to 72% in 2012. That's the comforting story if you're looking for one. So whites are 90% of the electorate in 1960, and they are 72% of the electorate in 2012. So there's your linear decrease. How much comfort should we take from this story? So what's happening among liberal pundits who are looking at dog whistle politics are they're saying it doesn't really matter. because there aren't enough old white guys is translated into the demographics are changing. By 2045, this is going to be a majority-minority country. Whites are a smaller and smaller proportion of the country. And even though Romney bested Obama by 20% among whites, Obama still won the election. This sort of race baiting doesn't matter. And I've got two sort of simple, basic responses. One, it matters enormously if the white majority of this country continues to be racialized in its sense of politics and the state and of themselves, right? It matters tremendously. And it'll matter in terms of policy, especially when you think about the control of the House. But it'll also matter when you think about local politics. And I'd say North Carolina and a state that, with first letter of W. And it could be Wyoming, but I was thinking Wisconsin, right? So this is going to matter tremendously, right? Even if Democrats keep winning, if whites continue to respond strongly to these sorts of racial appeals in a way that makes them quite supportive of anti-New Deal politics, this is going to be bad for everybody. Yeah. Second response. White as a category is not stable. And white as a category has tremendous potential to expand in a way that will keep this sort of politics vibrant for decades to come. And I'm especially worried about certain segments of the East Asian and Latino communities. Right? And so the Republicans know they need to reach more minorities. But crudely, some do. On the national level, Republicans at the national level know they need to reach more minorities. Now, on the local level, they may be ensconced in safe districts, right? So the average demographics of a House Republican district is 75% white. So the average House Republican member, right?
I heard it was 83%.
I don't think so. But I could be wrong. But I think it's 75. Okay. But average House Republican member, home district, 75% white. Okay. They don't need to reach out to minorities. But nationally, the Republican Party understands that it really needs to start doing this, so that you have this window where they're talking about immigration reform. I think what we're going to very quickly realize is they don't need to reach out to minorities; they need to reach out to a small subset of minorities, and that they can reach out to some minorities by appealing to them as fellow whites, who themselves are threatened by these non-white immigrants, especially recent immigrants. And there's a history of this within the Mexican-American community. According to the census now, half of all Latinos think of themselves as white. Republicans, they don't need to reach all that entire half. They need 10 or 15%, right?
I mean, I certainly, we'll see if that happens. I think the Tea Party is really getting in the way of the Republican leadership, who absolutely realizes that, but I don't know that the party is going to, that party is going to wake up to this reality in a meaningful way, because it is in the midst of its own civil war. I welcome that. That's great. So
I worry that they will, because, and so this goes back to our earlier conversation. One of the ways in which dog whistle politics is evolving is by pushing non-white faces to the fore. So the sort of racism that we're seeing now, I'll talk about this more tomorrow, but the sort of racism that we're seeing now is not hate every black person, hate every brown person racism. It's a racism that subscribes to a common sense in which minorities are threatening, but in which the person holding that view also understands himself or herself as foursquare against racism. And she can't be more against racism than when she supports a black candidate, right? A Herman Cain or Clarence Thomas, if you're coming from the law world, right? There is a move among conservatives to push black and brown people to the fore to espouse the same thing that George Wallace and that Barry Goldwater and that Ronald Reagan were saying. In that context, and I think a lot of those folks are Tea Party folks, in that context they are elated to have minority members, as long as they're repeating these same sort of cultural stereotypes about the threats posed by minorities. And in a way, that's going to create space even among these most racially agitated whites to begin to accept other people, as equals, so long as they could participate in this cultural drumbeat of the threat that's really coming from minorities. Not to be downbeat about the whole thing.
And so I think you offered here an answer to the question of what's wrong with Kansas. And
yes.
To put it in other words, why do people vote against their own interests?
Yes.
And I want to kind of add to what this gentleman asked, but I want to add the economic aspect, and just to talk to what you were just talking about. Why do these brown and black people come to be part of that new white face, right? The face of the Republicans and even of the Tea Party is, I think, to a large degree because of economics. Because once they come to be rich, or really hope to be rich, they become white, in a sense, and they go against, if you will, the interests of their large group. And I'm concerned about the power of the kind of rhetorics, the dog whistle politics, in a country that is not only really still very much racist, but also because of these politics, because of the economic politics, is becoming less educated.
That's right.
And as you know, the less educated you are, the more prone you are to follow the dog whistle. But also, as poverty increases among whites too, there is more of that willingness to blame people of color, and even towards fascism. And we see it happening right now in various parts of Europe, definitely in Greece. And I don't know that we won't see it here, right? So I would like you to add that aspect and tell us what you see when you look in your crystal ball about really the future of race relations and this country.
I think that's
internally rather than as an external problem.
Really terrific question. I like that you're asking to foreground sort of material interests in a way that's interesting. I think very few people are actually better off supporting the sorts of regressive politics that a Romney or a Goldwater suggest. I mean, we're talking Koch brother type money before you're better off. You need so much money that you need to be able to insulate yourself from the rest of society. You don't just need enough money to where you can pay for your own education. I mean, you need your own enough money so that you can be in a gated community and don't have to have contact with the people whose lives are being destroyed, right? So I really think very few people can come to these sorts of politics alone through a sort of a rational evaluation of their material interests. I think ideology is doing a tremendous amount of work, right? And so the question becomes, why is this ideology, why is this narrative so powerful? Now, for some people, it's going to be sort of that Ayn Rand ideology that's powerful, that the self-made person, how wonderful is it to think that you're superior to everybody else and that they're mere moochers while you're self-made. I mean, this is the rhetoric that Romney also used, claiming that everything he had, he made himself. I mean, it was insane, but yet he was saying this quite seriously. So, but the other part of the ideology comes from crisis. The attraction of it comes from crisis. We really are a country in crisis, and a lot of people are really hurting. You know, people have lost their jobs. They're hungry. Unemployment insurance is running out. People have used up their retirements. There's been traumatic downward mobility from the middle class into the lower class. And in this context, people need a story about what happened to them and who's to blame. And I think that there's a way that FDR understood that in a way that contemporary liberals don't. Right? FDR understood people need someone to blame. And we shouldn't engage in sort of demagogic scapegoating, but we ought to say, hey, concentrated wealth, malefactors of great wealth. These people, when they pursue their interests selfishly, hurt the rest of us. We can't allow it. Right? We need that sort of a story. Democrats aren't offering it. And in the absence of a story, I was reading a couple of people, they said, I think it was, resentment abhors a vacuum. People need to know who to hate. They need to know who to blame. And the Republicans have been consistently providing the answer. Blame minorities. Blame integration. Blame big government. So, in that context, what do I think is, you're sort of saying, what do I think is going to happen? In the book, I offer a prescription for a sort of a renewed racial movement. I will call it a civil rights movement. And I can talk more about what this movement might look like. Maybe I'll talk about it tomorrow. But I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't think it's going to happen because so many whites have bought into the sort of a colorblind ideology in which, wanting to get beyond race, they refuse to talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, you can't see what's happening. And it will continue to happen, again, at this sort of punch, parry, kick, constant racial insinuation, but never on the surface. So you have a sort of a cultural milieu in which whites insist that we're not going to talk about race, that we're post-racial, many liberals who are post-racial, and yet it's a milieu that's completely permeated by racial insinuation and is likely to get worse before it gets better.
I think you mentioned earlier that in the 1960s the ratio of a CEO's salary to a normal person was like 40 to 1.
Right.
And now it's like 350. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I think economics certainly has a play, and I'm just wondering where that fits in. Because
So,
it seems that in countries where there's a less of a gap, there's the happiness is better off than when there's a large gap, and if you need someone to blame in countries where there's such a significant gap between people's wealth, it's more likely that you can have like dogmas in politics where you're playing at people's emotions and targeting. It's not that the person's racist, but you're targeting emotions to win votes.
sorry, I missed that last one.
My personal thought is I don't think it's not the racism, but the politics involved. So maybe a person is not racist, but you're appealing to their emotion. That who is to blame for my standard of living right now? It's someone else's fault.
But why aren't they blaming the rich? And why don't the rich feel any sort of social responsibility? And that's where race comes in, right? So, if you think about the New Deal was I don't want to say that the New Deal wasn't about race. The New Deal was highly racialized because it more or less excluded all minorities. So the New Deal was by and for whites. And in a context of a sort of an economic liberalism that's by and for whites, you had a broad consensus that regulated capitalism and an activist government was the route to not only a prosperous middle class, but also a stable democracy. And this broad consensus was also shared by the CEOs. The CEOs they had their own internal culture. So it's not just market mechanisms that's setting CEO salaries. It's also culture within the corporations. And they had a culture that said, we're all in this together. And so when they said things like what's good for GM is good for America, it wasn't purely cynical. They really had a sense of we're all in this together. And so on both levels you had this consensus from the working class up and from the very rich down. Regulated capitalism is central to the health of the society as a whole and to democracy. What begins to break that down? It's people on the fringe like Barry Goldwater who find race as a wedge issue. And then Lewis Powell and whatnot. As that begins to break down, you begin to get a narrative in which, from the point of view of the middle class, the working class, the greatest threat is minorities and not concentrated wealth. And that's one dynamic. From the point of view of the very rich, you get another dynamic, which is we don't have any social responsibility towards those people. Right? Think about how striking this is. This is Mitt Romney, who wants to be president of the country, saying, I don't have responsibility for half the country. That's an incredibly antisocial position for anyone to take, for anyone in the society to say, half the people in my society I don't care about, I write them off. But for someone who wants to be president, it's unbelievable. Right? What has allowed this? And I think that the same thing has happened at the level of CEOs. They no longer have a sense of shared responsibility that extends to the workers. Now, part of this is race. I think part of it is globalization. right? I mean, so my colleague John Powell says, the elite today, they don't have a race and they don't have a country, right? Because all they have is levels of wealth that we have never seen before in the history of the world, right? And they may travel to Davos, they may travel to Riyadh, they may travel to Manhattan, they may go to Tokyo. They don't have a race, they don't have a country, right? And this helps also break down any sense of loyalty. Okay. Hi.
I have a question. So I can't recall all of the historical facts, but I know that at some point in the 70s there was, I think it's considered a large moment in like corporate businessmen like coming together and essentially deciding we're going to go.
You're thinking of 1971 and Lewis Powell's memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce saying it's time to build think tanks. Is that right?
I don't know about the think tank part, but it was in the 70s. And so is that really where like the big money comes into this story? I guess I'm kind of just lost in how the racial appeals have combined with concentrated wealth.
Yes. So I'm telling a story in which there's always been a sort of a burbling hostility to the New Deal. And some of it has been populist and some of it has been on the part of the very rich. In the 50s and the 1960s, what form did this hostility to the New Deal take? Partly it took the form of a fringe candidate like Barry Goldwater. It also took the form of support for fringe movements like the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society is just craziness, right? So the John Birch is saying things like, the John Birch Society is saying things like fluoride in the water is the communist plot to brainwash Americans, or the federal government is going to use Alaska as a repository to take all true patriots and put them in Alaska, right? Or they're saying things like the federal government is already 90% controlled by communists and Eisenhower's communist dupe. I mean, it's really crazy, loony stuff. The father of the Koch brothers, big funder of the John Birch Society, right? So there's always been big money hostility to the New Deal, and there's been populist hostility too that plays into it. So those things they don't emerge out of racism. Now, it's also true that they were deeply racist, right? But it's not emerging out of racism. It's emerging out of partly sort of grassroots paranoia, and partly it's big business would rather control government than be controlled by government. But I think that's really at the fringes. What changes, there are a couple of things that change in the 1960s, early 1970s. One, race emerges as an issue that is going to create broad popular support for an attack on the New Deal, right? And when I say broad, I mean think about what the 1972 election looked like, right? And that hadn't existed before. JBS was a joke, right? Second thing that happens is you begin to get, I'm talking about 1971 and Lewis Powell, you begin to get a sense on the part of corporations that they are being persecuted and that they need to organize and that they need a more aggressive defense of conservatism. And race is going to be one of the ways in which they defend conservatism. It's not the only way. And these two movements effectively coalesce, I'd say, with the Heritage Foundation and Ronald Reagan. Right? So Heritage Foundation, one of these massively funded, very powerful think tanks. Upon Ronald Reagan's election, they come up with a 3,000-page book of policies they'd like him to enact, and a year later they announce that he's enacted 2/3 of them. Reagan, on the first day of his administration, hands out a copy of the book to, which I haven't heard it. What's a 3,000? Anyway, each member of his cabinet gets a copy. Right. So these two movements come together, and it's not. I want to be clear. Racism isn't driving this. Racism's just a tool. Manipulating racial hostility in the public is just a tool. What's driving this is A, politicians who want to get elected, and B, concentrated wealth who see that they can help politicians get elected if they'll help them reverse the New Deal state in a way that helps the very rich. And again, all that sounds abstract and even conspiratorial, but if you stop and say, well, what are the policies that these people want? What are the policies that Romney and Paul Ryan are espousing? massive tax cuts for the rich, right? Slashed spending on social services and on government generally, which also has the effect, that's incidental to what they really want, which is lower spending on government. Control of the state regulatory apparatus. It's not that they want deregulation. They want control of the regulatory apparatus because they want to control any sort of new competitors. Right? Oil wants to control oil. All these guys, environmental regulations, they want control. All of these policies, you can see that it's in the interest of concentrated wealth. And then you can see the policy, you can see the economic impact on the middle class. And that's the story.
I think that the organization she might be thinking of, a Business Roundtable, forms in 72, the Trilateral Commission in 73 by David Rockefeller. So there's a series of these initiatives that responding in part to power.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking a lot about similar things, and I'm curious to your reaction to what I see as the way that this works is that the middle and working class white end up convinced that government, like my life sucks, is their experience, and increasingly it's getting worse, right? But the reason they can buy into this is because they see that government helps other people, not me, right? And so that's where they're actually losing the buy-in to the New Deal, because the way the racial politics makes this make sense to them is that, it's nothing in my life is going to get better by having more government programs, because those government programs are for those people who are not me, right? And that's, so to me, that's how the racial politics helps to undermine the middle class and get the middle and get Kansas to vote against itself.
Yeah. Just really quickly on Kansas. So that's a reference to Frank Rich's book. To Thomas Frank. Sorry, Thomas Frank. What's the matter with Kansas? One of the remarkable things about Frank's analysis is he actually says racism's no part of it. I otherwise think it's an excellent book. He's talking about the way in which the right uses cultural provocations, asks people to vote against social liberalism when in fact what they're voting against is economic liberalism, right? So I really like the book, but he completely misses the sort of racial component. And Pilar, in terms of your story, I think your story is correct if you understand it as a sort of a mythical claim rather than a material claim, right? Like when you look at the amount of funding that actually went to blacks and browns, and someone had this great study and they said, if you took all the money in the Great Society programs that went to blacks and browns and instead gave it to whites, it would have increased their net income or whatever by like less than 1%. It wasn't that anybody was actually losing out big resources, but they had a strong perception that things were being taken from them and given to these undeserving others, right? And it was a story. I mean, for me, the perfect example of this is Ronald Reagan saying, someone's standing in line buying T-bone steaks with food stamps, and you're waiting in line to buy a hamburger. You, the long-suffering, hard-working, tax-paying white person, are getting no help from the government, but instead, all of your work is going to be to pay for these guys who are lazy and don't work and are doing better than you, right? And that there's no basis in reality to that, but it had very strong racial resonance.
Well, and that goes along with the fact that all those southern states that are voting Republican are also, they are net gainers in terms of social, the taxes they pay in versus the money they get back.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. And then you read these stories of Tea Party members who are really mad at government because they're unemployed and government's helping them. And you're like, well, wait a minute. I mean, how do you explain that? Why would somebody hate government when unemployed they turn to government for assistance? And it's not. And I want to be clear. It's not that they're saying I hate government and they're not acknowledging that they're being aided by government. They're saying I hate government because government's helping me while I'm unemployed. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Until you back up and start to think, well, for 50 years they've heard the message that the people government helps are welfare queens. And now they're welfare royalty themselves. And it kills them. Right? They need the help. But they've come to believe that the only people who get help from government are chiselers and cheats and loafers. And so now they've got to square that and they say, I need help and I hate it.